Greetings, Planeswalkers. It's Chris, aka NAS, with Commander the Gathering. I hope all is going well with you and you're taking care of yourselves and the ones you love. This is going to be a little different around here for the next 5 episodes. Tommy Bear, buddy, you've picked number 7, and that was one of those inside the box.
What's in the box? Who's in the box? What's in the box?
What's inside the box? You might be asking. The box is aptly called my Bolas's Citadel. Inside are 5 decks, and these will be the next 5 videos. With these, you get one, you get them all, Tommy Bear. Bolas's Citadel is heavily themed, obviously, and I will go over it a little bit prior to the start of this video, but after a spoiler warning, because I don't want to give too much of it away and ruin the fun, but some people may want to know when it's not ruining too much. But before said spoilers, and before we venture back to Amonkhet, let's first go over the decks we've done. And very briefly, this Friday Night Magic or FNM series is me going over my 60 some odd commander decks, which is still climbing. My pals, Old Bearby and his rad brother Tommy Bear, and I were nerding out talking about Magic and started conversing about a couple decks and how they worked and all of that, and it progressed into this, and here we are. So far we have done the following decks. Deck number 11, which was Admiral Becket Brass. Deck number 40, Kamahl, Fist of Krosa. Deck number 1, Unesh. Deck number 57, Edgar Markov. Deck number 62, Firesong and Sunspeaker. Deck number 59, Morophon the Boundless. And number 3, Mizzix is Magnus of Chaos. And before we go any further into the deck, we're going to do our little spoiler warning. So spoiler, spoiler, spoiler. So before we hop any further into the deck and the themes and the fun stuff, this is a spoiler. I'm going to put spoiler on the screen until it's gone, but it will be very short. You've been warned. Here we go. Bolas's Citadel is a 5-deck box that consists of the first deck, which is now Scarab God. Then it has the other 2 Amonkhet gods, Scorpion God and the Locust God. And if you notice the sleeves, they're color coordinated where the commander and the deck match the color of the gods. I thought that was pretty neat. With that in mind, all of these decks are or consist of the Grixis color scheme. So once we're done oogling at these amazing gods, we have something that may be far more terrifying in the form of Thraximunder. And he is described as, in some lore, being Nicol Bolas's lieutenant on the plane of Alara and the Grixis shard of that plane. Theming the sleeves as I have, this gentleman, this wonderful, dapper individual, is sleeved in silver himself as second. And then next we have Nicol Bolas himself, sleeved in gold. I'm not going to go into the decks or anything further, and that is pretty much going to end the spoiler, and we're going to continue on. Spoilers and pleasantries out of the way, we start with deck number 7, as featured in my commercial, The Scarab God Has Come. In that commercial, I referenced the God of Cycles, and I think God of the Eternal Cycle may be fitting. We'll see how that comes up on the video, but I think I'm sticking with that. For a little bit of context, the Eternals are the Lazotep-coded army that Nicol Bolas formed in Amonkhet to help him travel across planes. Now, before we hop into what the deck does, I think maybe, just maybe, we should go over the commander, yeah? The Scarab God is a 5/5 god who costs 3 generic mana, along with a black and a blue mana to cast. His abilities read as follows. At the beginning of your upkeep, each opponent loses X life, and you scry X, where X is the number of zombies you control. The next ability reads, pay 2 generic, a blue and a black to exile a target creature from a graveyard, create a token that's a copy of it, except it is a 4/4 black zombie. And his tertiary and final ability, when the Scarab God dies, return it to its owner's hand at the beginning of the next end step. So there are a few things to go over, obviously. That first ability at the upkeep can work well in two main ways with the Scarab God. First, I can cast lots of little zombie creatures and strive for 2/2 zombie tokens. The reason I stress quantity over quality here is that Scary G's upkeep trigger, the way it works, I would rather have 10 power and toughness across 5 creatures and get 5 hits from the trigger, keeping in mind that Scary G is not a zombie himself, not yet anyway, as opposed to one large 10/10 zombie that only hits that trigger one time. In a perfect world, maybe I'd have 5 2/2s and a 10/10, but we're not there yet. So beyond casting my own spells, be it sorceries and instants that gather zombies or zombie creatures, the other way I can get Zeds is his second ability, which is conditional in that it does require creature cards to be in graveyards. This ability is very interesting because it takes a middle ground at 4/4 for the power and toughness. And what that means is, first and foremost, I get a copy of a creature as a zombie and will now start hitting those upkeep triggers for the Scarab God. Keep in mind, this is the crucial part. I get any ETBs, which are enter the battlefield abilities, any LTBs, leaving the battlefield abilities if they leave, and I get to use any abilities that the creatures have. But what I'm on about right now specifically is the power and toughness. This can take a 1/1 with double strike in an opponent's graveyard, exile it, and turn it into a 4/4 zombie copy with double strike, now potentially doing 8 damage, and also potentially hitting my Scary G trigger. So the way it tends to work out is you do get a lot of value from creatures with higher power and toughness, but a lot of that is conditional and dependent on the abilities of those creatures. A lot of them tend to have trample, for example. But I think you get more benefits from the ability, whereas it works out even better and you get more value on the field with a small body that now gets pumped up to a 4/4, as mentioned with the 1/1 double striking example. However, 4 mana for a 1/1 without an ability to just be vanilla 4/4 may not be worth it. So those are the things you take into account. And I know there are ways to reduce ability costs, but we'll get to that later. Last of his abilities is super neat in Commander. When he dies, it goes to my hand at the end of the upkeep from the graveyard. That can happen in any person's turn, so if it is your turn or somebody else's and you nuke the board at the end of that upkeep, he'll return to my hand and I can cast him after. This presents me with 2 options if he does die. Simply opting to skip that and putting him in my command zone and incurring and accruing the stacking commander tax, or I can have him stay in the graveyard and come to my hand at the end of the upkeep, cast him on my turn, and do it all over again. This can be a little bit risky in that an opponent can exile the graveyard or maybe steal a creature from a graveyard, which, spoiler alert, keep in mind, this deck does. And if he gets exiled from the graveyard, I would still put him to the command zone and incur the tax. But if that player goes to steal him from my graveyard and I don't have an answer, that creature's theirs for the picking. So now let's get into the themes of this deck, saving the most unique and flavorful for last. First, you're going to see milling, which is me putting my cards and forcing other players to put their cards in the graveyard, which the Scarab God can now target. Zombies. You're going to see zombies, even some zombies that didn't start as zombies. Some pretty neat enchantment shenanigans, and graveyard, graveyard, graveyard interactions. Now, the hidden gem in all of this is that Scarab God's ability sends creature cards from graveyards after they clone them into exile. But what if I'm not done? What if I'm not done playing with them, and what if I want to start pulling those cards back from exile and then use it again and again. The god of the eternal cycle would do just that, right? Graveyard to exile, exile to graveyard, and keep the cycle going. So Eldrazi are here. What you're going to see is that cycle where I will target your creature, make myself a clone of it, exile it, then I may cast Oracle of Dust, for example, or he may already be on the board. He allows me to pay 2 mana and take an opponent's card from exile, one I may want to clone again, and put it back into that opponent's graveyard so I can clone it immediately and re-exile it. Even better in this case, I can draw and discard off of that. So I can then put one of my big creatures in my hand into my graveyard while drawing a card, and then make a zombie token of that card I just put in. This deck excited me, and I have not seen this kind of engine and value set up before. I love it. I've mentioned before that I don't go out and look at other decks much, and so I haven't seen this, and I'm curious if you all have seen an engine like this before. Now all of that nerdiness and my own excitement out of the way, let's get into the other 99. Starting with lands, of course, there's a healthy dose of non-basics here, but most are just function that give me both mana types. However, there are a few worth noting, like these 6. First, Command Tower. This is important because if I steal a creature that has abilities, they may be colored and I may be able to use them. Svelenite Temple, I just kind of wanted to throw in there because it's old like me. It's from Fallen Empire, and it looks neat, and you can sack it for extra mana. Drowned Catacomb and Eldrazi Temple. Then the Thespian's Stage, which can tap for a colorless or copy any land in play. Opponent's lands also. This can be good for me for just my 2-color lands or opponent's lands as mentioned. And last we have Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth. All will be one. On to artifacts next, and mana rocks, starting with Soul Ring and Arcane Signet, as the Scarab God deserves nothing but the best. We have Sky Diamond and Mind Stone, and Commander's Sphere, and Dimir Cluestone. One thing about Mind Stone, Commander's Sphere, and Cluestone is I have ways to recur these if I sack them for draw. Then a legendary mana reducer in Kefnit's Monument, which also has me tap any creature upon casting a creature spell. These monuments are tricky. If you read them, I could put these in any color deck, any monument, in that they do not have a color symbol on the card. So, for example, Ronus's Monument. I could have it in this deck. That card reduces green creature spells I cast by 1, which would do nothing right then. However, similar to this card, it then reads, when I cast a creature spell, again, no color specified. Target creature gets +3/+3 and trample until the end of turn. I may look at maybe doing that in Bolas's deck, or I just think that is really neat because it can add a lot of flavor to decks, even if it doesn't add that reduction. Anyway, nerdiness aside again, we then have Lightning Greaves, making my commander or another creature a little more dodgy and shifty. The neat thing about boots in this deck also is that if I steal a creature from an opponent, place it on the battlefield and it has a tap ability or I want it to attack, I can boot them up really quick and have them do that. Now the more idle artifacts, starting with Altar of the Brood, which helps me mill opponents. Witchbane Orb gives me hexproof, but also gets rid of any affixed curses if there are any at that point. Altar of Dementia is not only a great way for me to get people to mill, myself included, but I can also use this as a response to board wipes or targets, for example. So their spell would fizzle and they mill. Mind Crank helps mill, and it is any damage, even opponent on opponent damage. Maskwood Nexus is such a wicked add to this. It makes everything I control zombies, and can make more zombies. Another new card, Pyre of Heroes, giving me a way to sack creatures and get other creatures out. Rings of Brighthearth, potentially allowing me to pay 2 and copy abilities, maybe like Scarab God's graveyard nabbing abilities. And then we have the Mimic Vat. I know this video is for Tommy Bear, but Old Bearby, you mentioned this card, and I have not had a chance to ever use it ever since I've played. I've seen it and interacted with it when opponents have played it, but I've never got to use it. Now, one interesting thing, Mimic Vat and Eldrazi. I just thought this was neat because of our conversations on it, and I just added this because of how this interacts. So this would allow me to do the following. You have Cool Creature on the board, and it dies, and I exile Cool Creature under Mimic Vat. I can then make copies of it, and so I can then tap Mimic Vat to make a copy of it, then cast in Eldrazi and remove that card from exile, put it back into your graveyard, copy it again, send it back into exile, and then the next creature that dies, just do that all over. Just graveyard and exile, shuffling and dancing to, again, manipulate if there's a creature that I want, and especially the worst is if I don't want you to have it, because similar to this, lots of other decks have graveyard recursion as a theme. One thing Scarab God can do, this is the trickiest thing and the worst, most dastardly part, and what makes me love Scarab God so much. I'm going to use a card. If my opponent plays a card and they're going to maybe exile a creature in my graveyard, or maybe try to bring, for example, their commander back from their own graveyard because they thought they were going to be sly and avoid the commander tax and put it in their graveyard. What I can then do is, once they go to target it with whatever spell or ability they are, I can respond and put my spell on the stack and take priority. So once the stack draws down, my ability triggers first, and their ability to go and grab whatever they just tried to is already gone and whiffs. It is so demoralizing to see, and I love it. I feed off of it sometimes. And in a little bit of hindsight, I'm thinking this card would work pretty decent in Admiral Becket Brass's pirate deck because you can keep those tokens that would be exiled at the end of the turn by activating Sundial of the Infinite. But onto instants. We have a utility card first in Tragic Slip. Somewhat conditional, but it's an instant speed for 1, so all you are waiting for is a creature to die at some point. And I have a lot of sacrifice outlets here, so they can be my own creature that died by my own hand, just to be able to do 13 damage to an opponent, essentially. Village Rites is a new card and an old card. Old in that it's been printed prior, but new in this art, and I really like it. Fierce Guardianship is just one of my cards. It's a great card for your commander. In essence, you can tap out and fool your opponent into thinking they'll maybe Torment of Hailfire, do some steel spells, or maybe wipe the board. Nope. My commander's out and I don't need mana for this. Hour of Glory is some instant speed exile and a little god on god action in the art. I like that. Moving on to sorceries now, we have Agonizing Remorse, another new old card that allows me to choose a card in your hand and exile it. Likely a creature that I'm going to steal in a turn or two. But also, one I may just not want you to have, something crucial to your plan or to your theme of your deck. I get lots of options with this. Decree of Pain, a big board wipe for lots of cards, or just a mini wipe for 1. Dread Summons for milling and some zombies at the same time. And then Consuming Vapors for some control and life gain with Rebound. Rise from the Graves brings a creature from any graveyard back under my control and also makes it a zombie. Diabolic Tutor can help me go find answers or the piece of the puzzle that I need to keep my cycle going. And another more niche tutor, but superb for this deck in Final Parting. This lets me tutor up 2 cards. One of them is going to go to my hand that I can use. The other will go to my graveyard that I can likely snatch out, put into exile, and have fun with later. And then Traumatize. Enough said. Enchantments, and this is where things get a little fun. Starting with Fool's Demise. This card is neat because it keeps coming back unless it gets kind of exiled. So I can put this on your creature, and when that creature dies, I will get control of it. Or I can put that on my own to keep recurring it. That's something that can be used to exploit ETBs and LTBs. Fraying Sanity is just so mean. Paradox Haze, because I want another Scarab God trigger this turn. Away from auras now and regular old enchantments, we have first Arcane Adaptation. Similar to Maskwood Nexus, it makes my stuff into zombies. Phyrexian Reclamation. In case I want to take one creature from my graveyard back to my hand instead of exiling it. Memory erosion, more milling, and now where the magic happens. Pun intended. First, Mirror Maid, which allows me to essentially clone an artifact or enchantment. And then its beefed up superior daughter in the form of Estrid's Invocation. First, both in the same light. The regular enchantments so far haven't been really worth copying, but think about fraying sanity on one player, then copying it onto them and milling them twice a turn for what they milled already, or sharing the love and copying it onto another player. Or Paradox Haze. That would give me one Scarab God trigger from him, and then if I have Paradox Haze already out, a second trigger, and if I play one of these cards and copy Paradox Haze, a third or fourth potential trigger. And onto the even neater thing about Estridge is that I can blink it in essence. So I can at my upkeep have it blink into exile and back out as whatever enchantment on the battlefield or artifact that I want. It can stay the same, I can make it come back as the same thing it was, or have it change targets. I can have it become Fool's Demise and use that to have a secondary way to steal or protect creatures. Keeping in mind that if I do that, when Fool's Demise bounces back to my hand because whatever it was on left the battlefield, I can recast it as Estrid's Invocation. But now let's move on to more enchantments that would easily be worth cloning, but are worth having around in and of themselves. Patient Rebuilding mills and nets card draw, and Training Ground. This will apply to any creature I have cloned, Scarab God's abilities or some of others that are soon to come. If I clone this once, it reduces all abilities by 4 in total, with Mirror Maid or Estrid's Invocation, for example. And now the meat of the deck, the creatures. First we have the Sad Robot, Solemn Simulacrum. This is a great card early and great card to clone. Each clone nets me at least one net up front and potentially card draw when that leaves the battlefield, and it may be a zombie when I reanimate it, or graveyard snatch it, as I should say. Consuming Aberration, no matter how it gets out by hand or by snatching, can be a game closer in this deck late game. And I can, again, try to recur it from the graveyard if needed. Burning Rune Demon is discard bait, or mill bait. Carefully read it and you'll note that what it does is let me tutor for 2 cards, and an opponent chooses one to go to my hand, which is great, and one to go to my graveyard, also great. So if I grab 2 creatures, both are likely to be bombs either in my hand or in the graveyard. And the one that goes to the graveyard is likely to just get yeeted right away by the hand of the Scarab God. Next we have Mist Hollow Griffin. I can exile it once it's dead, get a 4/4 Z version of it, and then recast it from exile as a normal 3/3 version. And then if it dies, do it all over again. Brian Shaman is an oldie, a goodie. I love this card, and it's a bunch of jank all in one place. It's a sack outlet twice over, so I can tap her, sack a creature, and this includes herself, and give another creature +2/+2 till the end of turn. That can be a combat trick or just a way to sack something to trigger something that benefits me or avoid something else. Or, get this, I can pay 1 and 2 blue, sack a creature, again, herself included, and counter your commander, any summon or creature spell. And spoiler alert, it's generally going to be your commander. Then I can bring this guy back as a 4/4, doing the same thing, and she's going to crush it. Ghastly Crypt is a spirit that extorts life and doubles swamp production, and in the same vein, Magus of the Coffer, a human wizard who kind of allows double swamp production in a different way. Then we step into the world of new Phyrexia. I could not leave these 2 out, as they are on point with the oppression and grim dark of this deck. And be it cast or discarded or milled and cloned, They are bombs. Shieldred, the Whispering One, and Jin Gitaxias, 2 Phyrexian Praetor beasts. They're just animals. Haymakers in this, and usually any deck. And then things just get a little worse or better depending on which side of the spell you're on. Spark Double. It's a clone, but the key here is that last group of words at the end, and they read as follows. It isn't legendary. If that permanent it cloned is legendary. Meaning, I can play this card and have 2 Scarab Gods, or 2 Jin Gitaxiases out. Or I can copy your commander or planeswalker that you have because I want one too. And then when that thing dies and goes to the graveyard, I can exile it and bring it back. Keeping in that grimdark spirit of Phyrexia, we're now going to move on to zombies. We have the Diregraph Captain, who can make my Zeds a little bit tougher, but also pings opponents for my zombies' deaths. Corpse Connoisseur, mwah, perfect. It's a zombie. It puts creatures in the graveyard. He unearths. He does it all over again when I snatch him out of the graveyard. It's just fun for everybody, mainly me and my graveyard. Havengull Lich. She's never one to be outdone, though. She allows me to cast any creature in any graveyard under my control and retains the abilities of that creature for a turn. Tormod the Desecrator. Yes, yes, yes. Zombie? Check. Wizard? Check. Nice art? Check. Old lore reference? Check. Gives me zombies when this deck does exactly what it does? Check. And then one of my top favorite Magic cards ever, and going back to Phyrexia with this one, Geth, Lord of the Vault. This is just 10 out of 10. He's Phyrexian. He's a zombie. He takes creatures from graveyard. He then mills at players while doing it on the way out. But he can also steal artifacts, which just makes it marvelous. The more you steal, the more they give you to steal from right after. And if Training Grounds is out, that reduces that ability by 2. Now that the creatures of this plane are accounted for, let's hop back into the blind eternities and see what awaits us and how it changes this deck entirely. I guess you could say these inclusions make this deck out of this world. A few of the more mundane and static interactions first. We get more involved going forward. Eternal Scourge is similar to the Griffin earlier in that I can cast it from exile. Thought Harvester exiles cards when I cast colorless spells, not when they enter the battlefield, and this includes artifacts. Mind Melter is a good combat promoter and allows me to force an opponent to exile a card from their hand, one that I can interact with later. Fathom Feeder is a card draw outlet that has opponents exile almost as a side effect. And then Sire of Stagnation, play that land, I dare you. And now the less static, more interactive card, starting with one I've referenced earlier with Oracle of Dust, that allows me to basically loot cards by pulling opponents' cards out of exile and back into their graveyard. Wasteland Strangler lets you pull from exile to graveyard to give a target creature -3/-3 until the end of turn. Blight Herder gives me Eldrazi Scions for pulling cards from exile to graveyard. Ulamog's Reclaimer bounces an instant or sorcery to my hand from my graveyard if I pull from exile to graveyard. Cryptic Cruiser pulls from exile to graveyard to tap target creatures, and this is also reduced by Training Grounds. And Ulamog's Nullifier, likely my favorite. It pulls from exile to graveyard to counter a spell. Yes, that just happened. And there's a couple interesting things to note about Eldrazi, and it is that a group of them are ETB triggers, and I think 1 or maybe 2 or 3 are cast triggers. This creates a situation where I need to maximize those. So the Eldrazi that have ETBs, I can exile from my graveyard and get the benefit of them still hitting the battlefield. However, a cast trigger is different. If I bring Eldrazi Blight Herder to the battlefield with Scarab God's ability, for example, that pull from exile effect does not take place as it is not being cast. It's part of an ability that's placing it onto the battlefield. So the recursion for those creatures is a little bit more nuanced, and that's why I have cards that both play out of exile and things like Shieldred and Phyrexian Arena, and others that pull to hand from the graveyard. Deck done and over with, let's talk about some quick combos like Fraying Sanity and Traumatize, one of my favorites. Those, coupled with Mirror Maid and Estrad's Invocation, would just be brutal. Cryptghast and Magus of the Coffers obviously synergize well with Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth, Ulamog's Nullifier, and Scarab God. If I have Nullifier in hand, I can cast it with Flash, do its thing to counter a spell. But if this card is in my graveyard, I can react to your spell, perhaps a board wipe or you stealing or targeting my commander. I can pay Scarab God's ability cost, snatch Nullifier out of my graveyard, and put it onto the battlefield, and when it does, pull from exile to graveyard 2 of an opponent's cards and counter the spell that I want countered. And then the last thing I do want to mention is that the cards that Training Grounds will interact with, be it by the individual card or if I copy it, Scarab God, Brine Shaman, Magus of the Coffers, Corpse Connoisseur, whose graveyard ability would be triggered, Geth, Lord of the Vault, Mind Melter, Fathom Feeder, Oracle of Dust, and Crypt Cruiser. And that about wraps it up. This is the first of 5 out of the box. So I hope you enjoyed the first deck out of Bolas's Citadel. Old Bear B, Tommy Bear, I hope you enjoyed it. And I'm not going to ask you for a number yet because you two are in number picking timeout. Bolas has decreed it. So I hope that you are all taking care of yourselves, taking care of the ones you love, and I'll catch you on the next one. See you then.